Fin the Week is brought to you by Indulge, a digital agency built on thinking for the global financial services industry.
Hi there, I'm Amelia.
I'm Paul.
I'm Russell.
And this is Fin the Week. How is everybody?
Doing very well, yeah.
Yeah.
End of another week, although let everyone into a secret, we're recording this on a Monday morning, not a Friday afternoon. So, yeah.
Feels a bit
But
weird,
we can
doesn't
pretend it's Friday, yeah.
We'll get that Friday feeling in it. But today we've got a bit of a timely follow-up to our previous episode. So last week we discussed the recently published GEO guidelines from Google. And in that discussion, Paul, you used The Economist as an example. And since then, it just so happens that we've stumbled across a real-life case study from none other than The Economist. So, Paul, what is this story?
Yeah, because last week I kind of went on a bit of a rant about Google's GEO guidelines and sort of said that I didn't think it was really that useful. And one of the things I said it missed out on was the idea that some website owners might want AI search bots to find and surface their content, but they might not want AI training bots to come and hoover up their content and use it for their own good. And the example I used was, as you say, the Economist being a publisher, they rely on people coming to them and reading their content and becoming subscribers. And so they want to remain findable, but they don't necessarily want all of their information to be repurposed by an AI chatbot. And so after we recorded that, I was kind of reading some news, some tech news online, and stumbled across an article on the Digiday website, and it was about The Economist talking about working on a concept for what they've called a two-track internet, so one for humans and one for AI agents. So they're sort of working on this concept that they're going to sort of surface select bits of content that are suitable for AI agents and keep the kind of important stuff behind the scenes for the humans. And they're testing out different methods of doing this, seeing how it works. So it was a timely kind of bit of news and something I think is worth us digging into today.
Absolutely. And this is going to be a bit of an exploration into the concept of a two-track internet, which we've kind of mentioned before. But shall we start with what the article itself actually has to say?
Yeah. So there's quite a few things covered in what's a relatively short article, but the kind of crux of it is that they've described it as the concept of a two-track internet is a strategic shift, and so they're sort of saying that a lot of the challenges that publishers and website owners in general face with how to deal with increasing levels of AI-driven bot traffic, some of it good, some of it not so good. Thinking of your website as having two tracks could be the solution. And so it covers topics like content gating and paywalls. So these are sort of terms people use to talk about when you might have high value bits of content hidden behind a paywall or gated behind a form. So The Economist, again, is a great example of this because as a publisher, their product is the information that they publish and the journalism that they produce. And so to have access to it, you need to be a subscriber. And so they have an actual challenge to figure out, well, how do we keep our product behind a paywall, but at the same time still get referenced in search results and in AI chats when somebody asks about something that we know about. And so they have to kind of overcome this challenge. And it's becoming more of a challenge now because AI chatbots can reliably, well, it depends on who you ask, but I'd say reliably reproduce a lot of the information that publishers promote. But it's also this subject is also relevant for financial services firms in general because it's not uncommon for finance firms to have content that is gated for one reason or another. It might be that they'll have a piece of proprietary research that is used as a way to attract new potential clients. And so you might hide that information behind a form, but at the same time, you're going to want the wider world to know it exists and to know a lot of the takeaways. And so there's a real challenge there about how do we publish this stuff, keep it for our own benefit, but make sure an AI chatbot can still understand it and surface the key takeaways, but without keeping it completely open so that the AI chatbot just hoovers it up and repurposes it all. So yeah, it's the article is kind of talking about that and about how the Economist is trying to tackle that with this concept of a two-track web.
I mean, this article, as I say, we sort of started last week. We were talking about the Google guidelines, and now, I mean, this was the big kind of question, wasn't it, Paul? The Economist was the example that you used. You know, on first glance, this article, do you think anyone's any clearer?
That no, the tone of this is very experimental. I would say, reading it, they're definitely pitching it as a real thing. They're working on this again. Two-track web is what they've called it, and so there are some quotes from Josh Monk, who is the VP of Generative AI at the Economist Group, and he has said a growing share of B2B buyers now start their journey with an AI chatbot, so ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude. And he has said agents want clear structure, questions and answers, ideally text, so not carousels, not art features, all of the stuff that sort of makes a web page look interesting and engaging, I suppose. So yeah, he's kind of giving this sense that, well, simply by saying that, he's describing a web where you have something that's engaging to look at and to view as a human, and the needs for an AI bot being slightly different. They just want the plain facts, easily crawlable. But it's also, it is experimental, because I don't think any of this stuff is proven. And something we'll get into in a bit is probably that how they're actually tackling this at The Economist by building a sort of what you could call a sandbox. So a sort of test scenario where they've got their own AI chatbot, their own AI solution in the background, where they can test their publication sort of approach to see how does our AI chatbot use what we're doing, how does it view the approach we're taking, before they kind of let it out into the world. But yeah, and I know Russ, you've put some thought into the concept that does a human user have the same needs as an AI bot user, if you can put it that way? And you'd kind of written something about this concept in the past, haven't you?
Yeah, so I was calling this AIX, which is essentially, instead of user experience, it's AI experience. And as a designer, do we need to be thinking about AIX and UX as two separate concepts? As in, an AI is essentially a persona visiting your website with a completely unemotional response to everything it sees. It isn't going to be distracted by banner ads. It won't be interested in other services. It will have a kind of a sniper like A to B goal, and it will find the quickest way to achieve that, carry it out on your website. It won't be influenced by colors or by language, which might be persuasive to humans. This seems slightly different because it's kind of going a layer beneath that, isn't it? It isn't going to be looking at the front end of the website like some of these earlier projects were. OpenAI had Operator, which would kind of, you'd give it a task, and then it would go to a website and carry out that task. So it would use forms, it would find information. If you wanted to, say, compare savings products, for example, you could ask it to do that, and it would go to the website and look at the site like a human and actually kind of scroll down the page and use it. And you could actually see it. I think it was, so Google DeepMind had Project Mariner, and you could see its thought process. It was saying, I'd scroll down to the bottom of the page. I can't find what I'm looking for. There's a pop-up, for example, obscuring a part of the page, so I can't find it. And it would actually be thinking like a human exploring the website, which is very different to what we're saying here. The way that The Economist is saying it's going to work is almost like an RSS feed, where it would, it's kind of going back to, I think an RSS feed uses XML and like kind of structured XML. But it's kind of like almost like a similar kind of way of looking at it, where you present structured data for this website that can be read by AI. So they don't have to go through all of those interfaces and just kind of pull the data. It can just find quickly what it needs. And there's definitely a speed aspect here as well, because if you've got an AI agent going through the front end site, that's quite a clunky, slow experience trying to find what it's looking for. Booking restaurants, comparing, products and all those kind of day-to-day activities that people would be using it for. I think when it's just finding information, that's where it works really well, like that kind of RSS example, because it could just pull content, like article content, back into what it's surfacing for the user. When it's going through like journeys where various information needs to be input and people are calling this human in the loop, let's say you needed to make a payment, for example, or would you trust the AI to do that on your behalf? I think you'd probably want a pop-up to make sure it is, you're making the payment using the right card, that you want to double check the amount. If you're making transactions between accounts, for example, would you want to do that through your AI agent, or would you feel more comfortable doing that through the company's app? So is there going to be a transition where if there is two internets, will that be everyone's preferred? Would that be everyone's preferred way of interacting with all these different apps and all these different accounts that you have? Would people prefer still to go onto their apps and trust that brand is surfacing exactly the right content, and you can validate everything via that app? Will we get to a point in the future where that kind of world of the internet would be phased out and people would just start managing their lives through one source and creating these two worlds? We might be moving towards a place where everyone just manages everything through one source. So I think it leads us more towards that path, which essentially is quite interesting, because if everyone could consolidate all of their apps, because all of that data is being poured into one, central point, then that's quite interesting from a management perspective of people's lives, which you can't really do with the internet and all the way that all the apps are structured at the moment. So I think AI opens that kind of possibility to have like your mortgage, your banks, your insurance, or your utilities, all drawn into this one kind of central management tool, using this kind of underlying layer of data, and everything's being kind of pulled into there. So I think that's perhaps where things are going. And that's, starting off with this second world of just pure data is probably a step in that direction.
That's maybe where it's heading in the long term. Kind of thinking more immediately with this kind of two-track internet, from a design point of view, is this, because you think about AI streamlining everything, making everything quicker, faster, but from a design point of view, is that, to me, that sounds like, is that double the work for you, Russ?
Well, I have thought about this. I have given this a lot of thought, and I think, an AI agent visiting your website is essentially going to be going through tasks in a similar way that a human would, and perhaps without, like, with perhaps being less taken off track. So is it a different persona? I think, structurally there's more considerations to make, especially with anything obscuring the page, because a human might look at it and close a pop-up. For example, an AI agent might really struggle with that. But I think it just comes down to just creating a really accessible experience, whether it's for an agent or whether it's for a human. So making sure that you use the correct headers, for example. So an agent can see, this is the title of the page, and then this is a secondary header, and like a third header, and this is a fourth header. You need to be able to easily go backwards and forwards between steps for different flows, like registration flows or onboarding flows. And I think it's the same kind of mechanics, but in my head, I'm thinking an AI agent would be better not using the front end, because that feels like a very human thing to do, because essentially it isn't interested in all the things that a human would be. And the business needs to look at it in a slightly different way as well. What's the point of producing all these kind of beautifully styled designs and interfaces for an AI agent who is only really who only really cares about that kind of end result and getting that information at the end. So it makes perfect sense for it to have a completely different experience to a human.
Mm.
And the only reason it would have an experience, the only reason it would need that is if you trained it to. Because if you trained it to want an experience like a human, it would probably seek that out and explore it. But all you need to do is really kind of train the AI to not be interested in that, and it wouldn't be. It's completely different. It just thinks in kind of a more binary kind of way.
Yeah, because the stuff you were just discussing there kind of gets to the nub of it. That what the Economist says it seems to be pointing at here is that 2-track web where you have a front end which is designed for and used by humans. You have then a sort of an alternative bot version, which I think they're saying would be based on simplified journeys, probably using technical solutions like what we discussed last time, llms.txt, a file that kind of guides bots around a site and provides like markdown versions of content, which is in layman's just sort of text-based, simple formatted text versions of the content and the journeys that you're preparing. So that's the kind of true 2-track approach that a lot of people are talking about online at the moment. But then the alternative, which you sort of alluded to a bit there, Russ, was a sort of, I suppose you'd call it a 1-track web, which is what we know and use now, which is where you have normal websites and you build agents that can work with those normal websites and use them. And so the question, I suppose, for a website owner at the moment is, do you build for the 2-track system where you're basically reproducing key bits of content in markdown format, let's say for the sake of argument, so that you end up with a sort of human layer and a text-based layer that sits underneath that only a bot would access, or do you work on your front end site to make it as clean and usable and accessible as possible, so that then a human or a bot could effectively use it? And I think I don't think there's an actual answer to that, but I would imagine the 2-track approach has a lot of benefits simply because it's more efficient, because AI systems use a lot of resource, energy, and kind of, basically all comes down to energy, which equals cost. And processing a markdown document is cheaper than processing a complicated mixture of HTML and JavaScript and whatever else happens to be on the page. I think simply for that reason, the markdown bot version approach makes an awful lot of sense. And I think that's what the Economist is sort of getting at here as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I guess you could use AI to turn your website into that fairly easily these days, because AI is just really, really good at crunching information and turning it into something structured if you give it that initial structure. So if you outlined what the structure of that kind of second version of your website needs to be like, you could either get it to crawl your website and create that, or, if you had access to the repository, it could crawl the files in that repository of your website and probably produce fairly quickly like a clean kind of like version of your website for that kind of second version. And what you might see in a lot of these platforms like Bing, like Search Console, perhaps you upload, as well as like an XML file, you kind of upload that. You could even upload that second version of your site to make sure it's being crawled properly, and that's being seen.
That's an interesting point, because I was gonna ask this from somebody, I have no clue about this. For somebody who's listening now, who owns a business, or and is thinking, "Oh my God, I've seen the Google guidelines, I've read this article. What am I meant to do with my website now?" Because to me, this sounds like a huge job, a massive project to make sure that your website is acting, accordingly for AI. Is that the case, Russ? You say you can use AI to help do that.
It depends what your website does as well. I think where it's going to struggle, and this is different to kind of articles, is when there's complicated processes like a savings account application form, something like that, which could be a number of different steps. Are we just saying that this second version of the web is more information based than, say, a transactional? Because I think when it comes to kind of forms and those human in the loop processes I was talking about, it'd be interesting to see how it copes with really complicated processes on a website and how it surfaces that back to the human. Is it pulling all those forms and surfacing it back to the human for that human in the loop validation within the within Claude, within ChatGPT, or wherever that initial request came from, or Gemini, and recreating the website so the human can use it. I don't really know how it's going to do that, because it isn't going to the website and carrying out those actions on your behalf, like I've seen some of the other agents doing. So I get it for like articles and content and research, and that absolutely 100% makes sense. But it'd be interesting to see how we move towards that second version of the web for those more kind of complicated like forms and process, and that way it needs more thought.
I think the answer is quite similar to when you think about the world of accessibility. So optimizing a system for accessibility guidelines. There are quite a few clear guidelines about how something should work, and it's usually a sort of just a process of simplification in many ways. So color contrast, for instance, is often about just keeping stuff clean, clear, uncluttered. I mean, I say color contrast, that applies to everything. But I wonder whether the way to optimize for an agent browsing a system, going through a form or something, is really about simplifying the process. So you almost converge on something, because humans respond well to simplified, uncluttered processes. Bots will respond in the same way. So you're kind of moving in the same direction, but perhaps from two different angles. But also, as you were talking, it reminded me of in a previous episode, we talked about the concept of design. And Russ, you mentioned that really fundamentally design is about solving problems. So design isn't about necessarily how something looks. It's about how a solution is pulled together. And so if you think about this challenge that the Economist is facing, and that everyone really will eventually face, is what are the problems that we need to solve? And they're looking at it from the perspective of two users. You've got the humans who use their site and their services, and then you've got the agents and the bots who use it. And I suppose when you look at it from that perspective, the problems are slightly different between the two groups, because the humans, as well as needing the information, well, I suppose how you communicate a news story, say with lots of data in it, to a human is probably different to how you communicate it to a bot, because a human will need that data to be visualized in a smart way. Like for example, Russ, you've got a diagram behind you there of, I think is it music genres or something?
Yeah.
And that's a smart way to show a lot of data to a human. Whereas a bot, you could just give it the spreadsheet and say, there you go, and the bot would get it straight away. And actually the AI chatbot would then produce that output for you for the human that's using it. So I suppose from that perspective, you look at what The Economist is doing with this 2-track system, that makes a lot of sense because, yeah, you put the human side of the site has a lot of the visual sort of clutter, I suppose, to make information understandable. The bot version is plain text, it's clear, it's just usable by a bot. And I think that approach makes a lot of sense. And I think companies in general will probably have to start thinking along those lines, especially if you're dealing with a lot of data or a complicated journey. How do you filter it right down to its core elements for a bot? And what are the add-ons that a human needs to make it easy to consume for them? And I suppose you want to work towards a happy medium where to avoid too much work, you're getting the core elements that work for both.
So shall we talk now a bit about trust? Because we know that AI agents can drive that discovery, but can they drive trust? And of course, if you look at something like The Economist, they rely so much on subscriptions, which, in turn rely on that trust. How does that work, do you think?
Yeah, I think this is the big challenge. So one of the other things that comes up in the Economist article, and I don't know if this is straight from The Economist or whether this was the writer sort of giving their view on it, but essentially the part of the challenge that the Economist has is that they have a really clear tone of voice. They're kind of famous for it. And so they will have a fear that even if their content gets the content that they want an agent to sort of understand, if they get referenced by that, say an AI chatbot that says The Economist says XYZ, they want to make sure it is in their tone of voice. They don't want it to be sort of muddled in a different tone of voice. And the reason the tone of voice is important is really because it's a trust signal. They put a lot of effort into having a tone of voice, a way of communicating, so that their readers know that tone of voice, they trust that tone of voice. I can't remember what the question, what the original question was, but essentially, an AI agent can definitely get you to a place where you see the information, you understand it. Can it then sort of help you start forming a relationship with a brand? I'm not sure it can, no. And actually, I ran a few tests. I sort of searched for a few things. So one was that I asked for I mentioned a particular firm, and I said, "Give me this firm's take on US inflation so far this year," and the chatbot, in this instance, I think it was Gemini, gave me a good analysis, but it didn't provide any citations. So it didn't mention any brand. So even though I specified which brand I wanted, it didn't cite anything from that brand. It just said, this is what that brand thinks. And then I kind of pushed it with a further question, and it still didn't highlight the source of what it was saying. So that's a good example of the chatbot putting words in the mouth of a brand. And it might have been accurate to the voice of that brand and what that brand actually wanted to say, but equally it might not have been. It might have just been a random string of words that made sense to me as a reader, but didn't give me any sort of discernible sense of the voice of that brand. And that's a big issue, definitely for brands like The Economist and publishers who rely on their tone of voice is a key part of their value proposition. But it's also an issue for any finance firm who needs to be credible, authoritative, recognizable in a crowded market.
It's quite interesting. You said, sorry, I was going to say it's quite interesting talking about The Economist. In the article, they were talking about these these little pods, these teams they've put together, consisting of, a designer, an engineer, someone who works in production, but they're also putting within those teams specifically editorial staff directly to ensure that they've still got that look and feel and, their tone of voice, which when you look at a publisher like The Economist, you're like, well, yeah, they've got the resources to do that, but doesn't mean that when we're going to get so much less from smaller publishers or just, independent writers who want to have their say.
Yeah. And I think even company, like, because one of the sort of modern tropes online for marketing is that everyone has to be a publisher. So if you are, I don't know, fund management company, you've got fund managers who produce commentaries on the funds that they're managing. You have to think of yourself as a publisher who's providing that commentary, and it's really important that what they say is in a particular tone of voice and does have the nuance that it's needed to clearly communicate something. And one of the fears with the way AI chatbots and AI systems work is that they strip out a lot of that sort of color that comes from someone's particular approach to writing. They're quite formulaic, and everyone will have seen this in practice when they'll have asked AI to write them something, and it comes out as factually fine but very dry and lacking in any kind of emotion. So it's a fear that I think brands have, and the Economist, like you say, have pulled together these teams, including editorial staff, and part of the reason for that will be that they build their own internal AI chatbot to test what happens. So they'll query their own sort of database, if you like, or their website basically, which is their archive. They'll query it and say, find me everything. What did the Economist say about XYZ news story? And their AI chatbot will come back with what it can get from their own setup. And they're testing that to first of all figure out, is it accessing the stuff we want it to? But secondly, is it pushing that out in a format that matches with our tone of voice? Or is it just sort of reducing it down to dry, basic language that doesn't suit us? And it sounds like, having read the article, that's the stage they're at. They're testing this internally before they roll out a sort of 2-track system approach.
I mean, you said it yourself, Paul, at the beginning. This isn't a super long article, but there is so much in it, so much to think about. Kind of looking at it overall, looking at this, thinking about the conversation we had last week with the Google guidelines. What should brands, firms, companies be doing now, moving forward in the kind of short to medium term?
It's a tough one, because even in the last week, I've seen multiple competing posts on LinkedIn that, with a group of people saying you should read Google's guidelines. They say you don't need things like an LLMs.txt. You don't need a markdown version of your website, so a kind of plain text version of your website. And then on the other hand, I've read other work where people have done a bit of research and they've found that markdown versions of content are surfaced much more frequently in AI chatbots. So completely contradicts what those other people have said. And even in the case of the Google document we discussed last week, that document said you don't need to worry about that stuff. But the Google Chrome team have again updated their sort of Lighthouse auditing tool, as it's called, Lighthouse, and that specifically mentions LLMs.txt, and it gives you guidelines, and it points you to the organization that oversees that. So it's just very confusing. And so for a brand, for a company that's running a website, and thinking of it from our perspective as an agency, what do we advise clients? And what I would say right now is you have to just be pragmatic with it. And I think come back to the design sort of thinking that we touched upon, which was that what's the problem that needs solving, and then go and solve that problem. And I think the problem for most content-heavy brands is you do have a set of human users and you do have a set of AI agents that are currently accessing your content, and they're going to, the AI agent side is only going to increase. That's not going to go anywhere. So I think you do have to start thinking about, well, how do humans and agents interact with our content? And how can we make that as clean and usable as possible? And that means for some organizations, it's going to be, actually, you've got a really well-structured website. It's not complicated. So just focus on keeping that clean and efficient. But for others, it might be that actually you do have quite a lot of complicated content and a complicated journey, and therefore thinking about an AI version of your site, like a sort of a markdown version of your site with a specific journey for AI agents, is probably not a bad thing to start thinking about. I wouldn't kind of bet the house on it, but I'd probably start doing some testing, maybe building your own or having your own internal AI chatbot with a sort of caged off version of your site that you can just tweak and play around with and test and say, if I use this AI agent to query our database of historic content, what does it come back with? What does it find? Is it what we want it to see? It's definitely not a kind of clear picture at the moment. One other thought that occurred to me while I was kind of reading through all of this was that a lot of the Google guidance was talking about search in the model that it currently works. So currently a search engine sort of crawls the web, it builds an index of content, and then it uses that index to surface search results when people request them. But I think the way that AI agents are moving, real-time search is going to become a thing in a way that it's not currently. So rather than querying an existing index, I can see a day when you would go to your personal AI agent and say, I want to search for this, go and look at these things, and it would go and look at stuff in real time. It wouldn't go to an existing index. I think it would visit sites and go direct to the source. And in a world like that, efficiency is more and more important, and therefore having a simplified AI version of your site, again, is a huge benefit for that. I'm not saying any of this is happening right now, but it seems to be the direction of travel. And again, it points to Google's document last week being not that useful because they're talking about what I think is a dated model. But I ultimately design thinking is the direction I'd go in, which is a good segue into Russell.
Yeah, I think a lot of brands are struggling with the concept that they're going to be represented perhaps as they may or may not want to be represented, as articles and as their websites are not only the information surfaced in these chat tools, but also potentially the browsers changing the way that the interface looks as well. Because as we talked about the Google patent with the generative kind of UI, and it feels like a lot of people are kind of, trying as fast as possible to control how their brand and how their voice is being received in this new way of people trying to find them, really. It's a completely new layer of if you look at the user journey, previously it was a search engine, and that would generally pull the information from the website without rewording it. Back in the day, you'd have your kind of your metadata that would kind of be what it would bring into the search results. Now, in terms of the research journey or the user journey for a website, there's now this kind of unpredictable layer of using AI. It can hallucinate, it can reword articles, it can represent your brand in a different way. How do but like you say, these businesses are putting dedicated teams and trying to recreate what these AI chat tools are going to be surfacing to the user, desperately to try and retain control of their brand. It's a really interesting transition. I still believe that, personalization is one of the most exciting things about AI, as for everybody, especially for those with access needs or cognitive access needs or other needs. Talking about forms and really complex user journeys, if someone's using Gemini and it can recreate all the forms in the way that suits that user, then why would that just not happen within Gemini instead of an augmented experience where Gemini would essentially rebuild the website? It's going to be one or the two. I don't know which way it's going to go. It will either be recreated in that one central place where you've searched and and make sure for that user it has a bigger font size, let's say, so they can read the form labels and they can read the copy better. Perhaps it distills everything down to just black and white, for example, because that's their preference, and it almost just kind of lists everything out, and the user goes through it in that way. Or for some journeys, it would take the user to the website and it would recreate it and create an augmented experience which would be suited to that user. And perhaps it's both, but yeah, it's creating those possibilities, which is really exciting. But I see all the big brands kind of fighting to kind of stay in control of their brand, and that's why we're kind of talking about this a two-track internet thing.
I was just going to say, I ran a couple of other very basic tests. This isn't scientific at all, but I searched for particular fund performance and an update on the approach that the fund manager had taken using, again, Gemini. And it gave a good overview, but it didn't once give a citation for the brand that actually runs that fund or mention the fund manager. What it did do is it pulled from commentaries that came from aggregator sites and news sources, which would suggest to me that the AI chatbot is relying on sources that it finds are easier to draw up-to-date information from. And then again, I used Gemini to search for a key information document, so a KID for an investment product. And again, Gemini correctly explained how it all worked, but it didn't give a citation from the brand that comes from. What it did do is it offered up a landing page for an app on the Google Play Store. So whilst on the one hand, Google in their document really went down the line of search in the world of AI isn't different to search how it used to be. On the other hand, that Gemini is sort of biasing in the tests I ran, biasing towards sources that are clearly easier for it to draw information from, because it can. I would argue that aggregator sites and news websites are probably structured in a way that just works well for AI agents, and the Google Play Store is an internal product, so they presumably plug into that database in a much deeper way than they do a typical fund management website. So yeah, I think the conversation we've been having today about this concept of a two-track web is kind of at odds with the document Google published that we spoke about last week. But I would argue that everything we've seen and the direction of travel would suggest that a two-track web is the way things are moving, because it just makes sense. For an AI agent, having a dedicated, structured setup makes perfect sense, and I can't see it not going that way. And I think brands need to sort of start thinking about that.
Yeah,
That seems. Yeah. Are you on the same page there, Russ?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I noticed on the Economist as well is just the amount of advertising on there. It's going to be really interesting to see how that's managed. I'm sure it's quite heavily monetized, and almost certainly, those adverts aren't going to be displaying in Gemini, even if there is a citation for the Economist. So how are these websites going to navigate that and survive? Some of them, perhaps. I guess it must be a really big part of their business model. It must be a massive part of their business model. And essentially, they're just going to lose all of that if people aren't visiting their website.
Yeah, it's the same, isn't it? It's relevant for publishers because they need people to land on their site to see the adverts, to pay for the product, or to subscribe and then pay for their content in a different way. And then it's the same for commercial brands who, they need people to arrive there eventually and to trust them as a brand, because otherwise everything becomes a commodity. And price becomes the only differentiating factor. But as we all know, you kind of get what you pay for a lot of the time, and price isn't the only thing that matters. And we can't have a world where agents are just reducing everything down to to the basics. You need so yeah. Again, the 2-track web kind of seems to be a solution towards that, because it means that you can start to much more carefully manage what is surfaced.
Hopefully, I mean, a big conversation, probably asked more questions than we answered, but hopefully made it, a bit more clearer for people. Shall we play some jargon busters?
Yeah, see how we do.
Shall we? Last week, you guys didn't do very well. I feel like up until now, you've always kind of been along the right lines, but last week with churning, not so much. So let's see how you get on this week. If you've not caught this before, this is where I put the guys to the test with some kind of industry terms, some jargon, to see how well they know. So this week's term is haircut.
Blimey.
Oh, I don't know. I'm going for one of those tomorrow. I don't think it's related to that.
Yeah.
I can have a go first, because I always seem to kind of hold back and go second or third. But I wish I didn't say that now.
Yeah.
It must be. Is it kind of? It must be taking a bit of something off the top. It isn't. I don't know. It's difficult to say. But and trimming kind of springs to mind as well. Must be in the context of we seem to be on this investment track with a lot of these terms, so I think I'm going to stick with that. And perhaps is it maybe trimming down your investments, the ones that aren't working, perhaps, or taking some money off the top if you've made some money and kind of moving that to kind of somewhere else. Feels like maybe one of those two, but I'm not sure which one.
What do you reckon, Paul?
Yeah, I agree. We always move towards the world of investments, and I can't escape that. But I feel like it's in that world, and a haircut is about removing excess, I suppose. So it's trimming off some of your investments, but you wouldn't be. It would be to make the portfolio look better afterwards, which is like a haircut. You take off stuff you don't need to look better.
Well, hopefully we'll see tomorrow, Russ, if it's better. Shall I tell you? So it's the percentage reduction in the value of an asset when used as collateral. So sort of, we're talking about the trim, but specifically the percentage reduction in that value.
Okay. Yeah, so it's less of it's a result rather than an active thing someone's doing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I see. Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
I don't know.
Well, we got maybe. Have we got like half right? Maybe.
Yeah, we'll give you half a point, but maybe you need to go away and do a bit of revision before next time.
It'd be interesting to see maybe after 10, 20 episodes how many we've actually got right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I might keep a little tally and we'll see.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for listening. That is about it for this week. But we will be back next week. Russ, enjoy your haircut.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Cheers. See you.
Bye. Before we go, it's time for a quick shameless plug. This episode was brought to you by Indulge, a digital agency built on thinking for the global financial services sector. If you're looking for an agency that can specialize in UX and design, production, and marketing, then look no further. To find out more, visit indulge.digital. Thanks for listening.